Well, good evening, and welcome to the Federal Way City Council special meeting for July 17th of 2018. Would you all please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, welcome. So we've got a great presentation. I've got Yarden Weidenfeld, Senior Policy Advisor at the rostrum right now. We're going to get started. I want to let everybody know, I think it is going to be important that we recess at 10 minutes to 7. Just want to tell everybody right now, because we do have a regular business meeting that starts at 7 p.m. So, and I think it's only fair to give council about 10 minutes to prepare for that at a minimum. So with that, I'll turn it over to Yarden.
Thank you, Mayor, members of City Council. It's been an honor over the last year and a half to serve as a staff person for the Mayor's Quiet and Healthy Skies Task Force. And just as a little bit of a sort of hot off the press update, the Mayor's directed that, and I have emailed people about this, the Mayor's directed that the task force final report will be presented at the next and only August meeting of City Council, August 14th, 2018, at the regular 7 o'clock meeting. And the report itself will be distributed widely and ready well in advance of that meeting. The Mayor's directive to the task force was to, and I should mention that former chair of the task force, John Reesing, is here, as well as task force member Chris Hall. And I would say that one of the Mayor's main directives is in that task force was to look at the upcoming Sustainable Airport Master Plan, which, or the SAMP as it's been called, which is a major development and to some extent expansion project that the port is working on, and trying to figure out the best posture that the City of Federal Way could take towards that. As indicated on some of the handouts, the scoping process for that master plan will now begin on July 30th, and we have here with us Port Commissioner Ryan Calkins, the Port's Director of Capital Project Delivery, Claire Gallagher, and the Port's Director of Aviation, Environment, and Sustainability, Arlen Purcell, to explain what the Sustainable Airport Master Plan is and where it's going. And I think that this presentation will also therefore help City Council when in its review of the final report of the Mayor's Task Force. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Arlen Purcell, Director of Aviation, Environment, and Sustainability. We really appreciate your time this evening and a chance to present to you on the Sustainable Airport Master Plan and the upcoming environmental review. I hope our presentation will answer a lot of the questions that you may have. We're going to start out with a few remarks by Commissioner Ryan Calkins. Thank you.
Thank you, Arlen, and thank you all for inviting us here to present. Tonight I'm going to give just some background points and talk a little bit about why we commissioners are doing as much as we can to engage with and predominantly listen to the communities of King County, and more important than just generally the communities of South King County that are most affected by airport traffic. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why we do a SAMP, and then the experts are going to come up and give the really detailed analysis of where we are in the SAMP process and how, as council members, mayor, citizens, you all can help us to craft the best possible airport master plan going forward. So the purpose of the SAMP is in part because as a federal grant airport, we are required to do long-term planning for the airport. And so this is the mechanism by which we do that. And we look at a few numbers, that some of which are generated by modeling from the Federal Aviation Administration, that tells us here is what unconstrained demand would look like at the airport. Here's how many people would fly if there were no other bounds on that. And then based on that, we start to input other constraints on that would limit that total number and get to a number that we think would be accurate in terms of capacity. Our job as an airport then is to try to figure out a way to accommodate all that, including all the processes that you do, such as environmental review, citizen input, to say there are positive and negative externalities with the expansion of an airport or with aviation generally. And how do we do that in a sustainable way, which is we added that at Seatac to say we need to do this in a sustainable way, not simply how do we grow as fast as we possibly can. I first became familiar with this process as I was campaigning a year ago, and I can say that the Marine Hills community here in Federal Way was absolutely instrumental in helping me to understand the issues that have affected the communities around the airport. And I particularly want to call out Chris, who has demonstrated not only a capacity for presenting information in a way that is helpful, but also usable for us to be able to go to the other stakeholders and say, here are the real issues the community are facing, here are the data to back those up. And then looking at ways that we as port commissioners, as council members, as our state and local elected officials, what we can do to impact that. So, where are we at the process? We are early on in the environmental process. We're going to open up a scoping window here where community members have an opportunity to give input. And my colleagues are going to share much more about that. But I also want to let you know some other parallel processes that are happening at the same time. I think one really important one is something called the Regional Aviation Baseline Study. That has just been agreed upon by the Puget Sound Regional Council, and effectively what it will do is create a description of the commercial or the aviation demands in our region, and Puget Sound Regional Council covers Snohomish, King, Pierce, and Kitsap counties, and it will say what does the region need in the next 20 to 40 years. It's not going to tell us how we get there, but it will give us the data to then be able to say how much of that should be at Seatac, how much should be at Payne Field, how much should be at JBLM. And this is both passenger and cargo and general aviation. And so we are looking at that study as a much broader study at the need for aviation and how we accommodate it. And then finally, we are working within certain constraints at the airport. We are crazy overlapping jurisdictions. There's the Port of Seattle itself, there's the FAA, the TSA, CBP, lots of federal agencies that govern certain parts of what we do. And then, of course, we are nestled within the city of Seatac, the King County, and the state of Washington. And all of these jurisdictions have some control over this process. And so we are trying to work with everybody in tandem to come up with the right solution. At the same time, we recognize that there are certain unavoidable negative impacts associated with aviation, noise and air pollution in particular, but I think a lesser recognized but probably equally important is the impacts of traffic congestion, getting people to and from the airport. And so we are, as a part of the Sustainable Airport Master Plan, trying to address those issues as well. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Claire, who's going to go into much more detail about the Sustainable Airport Master Plan. And I'm also going to ask your forgiveness because I'm supposed to be in Kirkland at 6:30. I'm going to try to stick around until 6 to be a part of the Q&A, but I do need to run shortly after that, and I'll be a little bit late for that. And I will say that I genuinely read every email that comes to me. I know I've received emails from a few of you recently and over the course of the last year. And that is an excellent way for you to raise issues with us. I read every one. You can call me on my cell phone. That's all available on the website, and I do answer those requests. And we do take that information to heart and really work on getting responses quickly. So thank you all for your time again. Thank you, council members and mayor, and I'll turn it over to Claire.
Thanks, Ryan.
So basically, I think we just have to go like just this down.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, council members. Again, thank you for allowing us to speak to you tonight. I'm Claire Gallagher with Port Public Affairs. I'm based at Seatac Airport, and I think you can hear me okay. I'm going to step through some slides. They're fairly high level. I'm going to do them rather quickly in the interest of time, but I will be here, and we have several members of the team here to answer questions afterward and dive into specifics, whatever best suits the needs tonight. I know that you have your council meeting beginning at 7, but Commissioner Calkins asked me to step through some of the specifics. I've been working on the master plan process since 2015. We kicked it off in 2014, so I hope that I can show you some information that's of use tonight, and then certainly following up wherever there might be questions. So the reason that we're here tonight is really to make sure that you're current and up to speed with the capital development at the airport and the master plan that we have underway. We are required to plan, just as your city is. When you plan, you can meet demand and plan for projects and embark on growth and management in a much more comprehensive fashion, and that's exactly what we're doing at the airport. People will continue to come to the airport. We've certainly seen that over the past, especially 5 years of growth, but Seatac has never had more passengers than it has had this summer. We have had more operations in the past, but we continue, and this region continues to drive tremendous amounts of growth and demand for air transportation, and we see that at Seatac. If we don't have a plan, people will continue to come, the congestion will be worse, the flight delays and the traffic will not meet the expectations that people have of the system. So we're going to embark on this and do the best that we can to meet demand and see where it takes us. Our current status is with a master plan, which is a high-level overview of basically our facility and how to invest in it. And we have, after 2 years of very intensive work, landed on a phased approach to this work. We had intended to do the full 20-year planning period in one fell swoop. We have decided that it is best to do a phased approach because we can't meet that full 20-year forecast without some significant changes, and we need to step back, get more information, and then in the meantime, proceed with the work underway that can meet the near-term demand. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. We're also going to focus on the fact that our environmental scoping begins at the end of this month, and my colleague Arlen Purcell will talk to you a little bit more about that tonight. Very important to have members of the public, local agencies, cities such as yourself engaged in that environmental scoping process and work with us to look at the impacts and benefits of the plan as we propose it. So just as a reminder, some of this you probably see, but I just want to emphasize the way that the regional economy drives demand and activity at Seatac. You can see on the screen, we've jumped to 9th busiest. We were at 16th busiest about 6 years ago. Most of the passengers, nearly 70%, begin or end their trip at Seatac. That means that we have a very strong market here in this region. We are serving the people and businesses of this region. We are not an airport where passengers connect primarily. An airport such as Atlanta, if you have flown through there or are familiar, 70% of their traffic is connecting. It is not beginning or ending the trip there. So we're just the reverse at Seattle. We continue to grow. We grew very strongly in the middle part of the decade. We tailed off last year to under 2% growth. We're about 5% growth anticipated for this year, but we're ahead of the curve from what we had forecast and expected to see. We have very healthy carriers, both Alaska and Delta, rather than taking from each other, are both increasing their market share at Seatac. So we're a very popular region and destination. We continue to have good strength in the international market. The reason that's important is because it's an indicator of strong business success. It really enables the trade-dependent nature of this state, and as well as it indicates that each of those flights brings millions of dollars to this region just by the virtue of the business that they transfer. So it's always a good thing to be able to offer international service. This is a complicated chart, but we think it's important to have in here. It comes from statistics from the Puget Sound Regional Council. On the left-hand side is the future population growth. It begins at 2.5 million in 10, actually, it starts at 3.5 million, but the bottom of the scale is 2.5 million. 3.5 million regional population, that's central Puget Sound, and it continues to climb over time. That is the blue line. Seatac's growth tracks that very, very closely. It's not a one-to-one. You can see the right-hand scale is 60 to 70 million passengers in the future. But we're showing that as the region's population climbs, the demand at the airport climbs as well. Operations climb, numbers of passengers climb, so it's a strong indication of future demand as well. We've been asked especially to show operations over time. We realize that is a source of impact to people, especially in and around the airport area, and we can show you that our airports actually overall peaked in 2000. We had the highest number of operations, which was about 460,000. We have not exceeded that at this time, but we will show you that the fleet mix, the types of planes are larger than what we've seen then, and that has created more perceived impact and real impact. They're more frequent flights, they're larger planes. That's really happening, we know that. So as we face this demand and this future growth, we're concurrently, at the same time, managing 3 different tracks to handle what's in front of us. On the left hand are the current projects we have underway. You may see them as you transit through the airport. We have the North Satellite redevelopment happening at the north end of the airport. We have the International Arrivals Facility happening on the south end of the airport. Each of those projects is well over $600 million in value, and they're an integral part of our future operations. Alaska Airlines is about 50% of our passenger activity at the airport, and that North Satellite is a key part of their future activity and their partnership with the port. We also have other projects underway, and that it represents nearly $3 billion in construction activity on the ground. In the middle are the near-term projects we're going to talk about tonight. This is what we're proposing for future expansion at the airport to handle this future demand, the near-term demand, certainly for the next 10 years. And the long-term is something that you heard Commissioner Calkins talk about. We're participating in the Puget Sound Regional Council baseline study. We have to do our own additional study to see how to manage future growth, and that will come with additional environmental review as well. So just as a reminder, many stages of activity for a master plan. We are just about in the middle environmental review. So we have completed the things above the environmental review, and we are approaching the environmental review and working through those remaining elements. And happy to talk more about them, but let me keep moving in the interest of time. So in front of you is a diagram of the projects that we're proposing for the near term. It includes improvements such as a second terminal to the north in the current location of the Doug Fox parking lot, if you're familiar with that. We have a realignment of the roadways to increase capacity and improve that congestion on the drives and on the curbs. We have an automated people mover system that we're proposing that would use an improved busway and kind of a mini transit center at the north end of the garage. We have taxiway improvements, which are the bright colors in the middle of the airfield. At the top of the picture is moving our west side, moving our maintenance campus to the west side so that we can expand future gates and parking positions and a concourse that goes with the new terminal. So these are the things that we've determined that we need to meet the future demand through 2027 for our forecast for passengers and operational growth. And that forecast is both passengers and cargo movement. We're doing what we can in our footprint to meet that need, and we're comfortable that this can be accomplished with our current configuration. It's still over $4 billion worth of new work on top of what we already have. But the things that we know that we need, gates to reduce delay, curbside to reduce delay, expansion on the roads to reduce delay, these are all things that directly reflect the constraints we have today at Seatac. So just a note on the outreach, such as we're doing tonight with you, we've worked very hard to cover the region, but it's very difficult to provide the type of information that everyone needs when we just use one person-to-person platform. So we use a number of platforms. We're here tonight in person with you. We have all of this information loaded online. We have electronic newsletters. We have hard copy paper newsletters we still use to over 60,000 homes in and around the airport area. We have external stakeholders that we know we need to reach, and we do extra work to go where they are, as opposed to try and have them come to something that's already scheduled. And we'll be doing community events as well as this type of scheduled council presentation. We'll do over 30 events just in June, July, and August this summer to make sure that we have the word out, as well as direct mail, advertising, and digital display and that type of thing. So if there's a better way, I'm happy to take any suggestions, anything that works. I'm always interested to look at it, and we have a great team that supports that work. Our next step is going to be to begin our environmental review at the end of this month, and I'm going to ask Arlen Purcell to talk to you about that. She's our SEPA responsible official at the airport and our director. Are you director of? Director. Yep. Arlen's going to introduce herself, so all the words come in the right order. But thank you for your time, and again, I will be here and happy to answer questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you again for the opportunity to speak this evening. Arlen Purcell, Director of Aviation, Environment, and Sustainability. So because we operate an airport and because we are subject to FAA regulations, and the FAA will be approving a modified map of the airport, and they will help to fund our projects, the master plan is going to have to go through a federal environmental review process, as well as the state environmental review process that you may be more familiar with. Some of the purposes of environmental review are shown on this slide here. I want to emphasize that we're going to be doing our analysis based on standards and established procedures set forth in laws and regulation and guidance. One of the first things that we'll be doing is we'll be looking at the master plan forecasts, and we'll compare those with the official FAA forecasts, which are updated every year, and we'll be looking at the SAMP forecast relative to recent trends. We don't want to understate impacts. That's very important to us. One of the key principles at the heart of environmental review is looking at ways to first avoid impacts. If we can't do that, try to minimize impacts. And if we can't do that, then find ways to compensate for those impacts through mitigation. Those are steps that we will undertake during the environmental process. Ultimately, environmental review is a disclosure process. It gives decision makers the information they need so that when they decide to take an action on a project, in this case, moving forward with the master plan, that they understand what the potential environmental impacts might be and what the trade-offs are. To make that work, transparency and public engagement, really important part of that. Claire talked about some of the extensive outreach that has been done to date. I'm going to talk a little bit more about scoping in a minute. And then environmental review is in a way an overlay of all the relevant environmental laws and regulations that are out there. So we will take into account federal, state, regional, local environmental laws and requirements as appropriate. All right, so this is the map showing the projects that we are going to look at in the federal and the state environmental review. This map is very similar to the map that Claire just talked through. One of the main differences is that it shows a few projects north of 518. And those include some cargo warehouse development that's in that kind of a L, sideways L at the bottom there. Some ground transportation features in the on the right end, and employee parking as well, right end and in the middle, and then a distribution, centralized receiving and distribution center at the top there. These 30 projects will be looked at individually and together because we want to make sure we cover the what's called cumulative impacts of them all together. And we'll go into the purpose and need for the projects when we do the environmental review, but overall, the intent here is to meet future passenger demand, meet future cargo demand, comply with FAA standards, be operate more efficiently if we can, and then provide enough fuel reserve, and at the same time try to meet some of our goals for use of what's called sustainable aviation fuel. So we are going to, this slide shows what we're hoping to do, our planned approach based on what we know at this time. And we are going to try for a single combined federal, that's NEPA, and state, that's SEPA, environmental document and process. And it's a little bit complicated to do it this way, but we think it's important to have all of the information in one place. We want to make sure we're consistent in what we report and in what people have a chance to see. We're going to try to make the presentation of the information as clear as possible, and we're going to use one set of outreach meetings to cover everything, so people don't have to worry about, oh, am I commenting on federal or state? You can just go to one place to do that. We are anticipating, based on what we know now, that we will be preparing a draft environmental assessment under the federal process. And I need to emphasize here that what that document ends up being called depends on what we find out. So if we were to find that there are significant impacts of the master plan that we cannot avoid or mitigate, then we may be preparing a federal environmental impact statement. If not, then it's appropriate to call the document an environmental assessment. I want to reassure people that we're going to be doing thorough analysis no matter what. We're going to be doing the analysis based on the standards and the guidance that are out there. That would be the case no matter what the document's called. At the same time, we'll be preparing a draft environmental impact statement to meet the state requirements. And the federal and the state requirements don't line up exactly, so it can be confusing. But basically, the intent here is that the port is the lead agency for the state process. We have a chance to really take a hard look at impacts where we have some authority, and the use of the state EIS process allows for us to maximize agency and public involvement. So we're going to do all that together. So this is a long list of the environmental impact categories that we're going to be looking at in the document, and the intent of this list really is just to tell you that we're going to look at everything. Every category that's listed in the federal and in the state guidance we'll be looking at. Exactly how we're going to be looking at each category, I cannot tell you today. That's really the point of scoping. And the idea behind scoping is it gives agencies and the public a chance to talk about, provide input on the topics that you would like to see covered in the environmental impact document, and the major issues that you say are important. And then we will use that input to come up with our scope. So we're trying not to prejudge how we're going to do these things at this time. So this is a timeline showing where we've been the past couple of months and where we intend to go. And there are copies of this on the table at the back if you'd like to take one away with you. We are getting ready to start the environmental scoping process, and so there will be an opening of the process July 30th. The process is going to, the scoping period, is going to last for 60 days, and so that ends September 28th. There will be information provided on the port's website about the proposed master plan, the upcoming public meetings, the different ways that you can comment, and there are a variety of ways that the public can comment directly through the website. You can write to the port letter or email, or you can attend one of the public meetings. And we are planning on an agency scoping meeting in early September, followed by a series of public meetings the weeks of September 10th and 17th. There will be an official stenographer present at those meetings to take down your comments verbatim so that we will have every word for the record. And one of the meetings is going to be held in Federal Way. I just want to make sure I get this right. It's going to be held at the Federal Way Community Center on September 17th. And the details on all of the meetings, dates, times, locations, will be provided on the Port's website. After scoping, we will combine and review all of the comments that are submitted, and we will report back to our commission on how those comments have affected the scope of our document. We will then do the analysis, and in 2019, we'll be publishing a public draft environmental report, and there will be time then set aside for the public to comment, with the idea that we would wrap up the process around the end of 2019. So that concludes our presentation, and we're available to answer questions.
Thank you. Do you have a time for the September 17th meeting at the community center? I would just want to make sure everybody here hears it and on TV.
Sure, absolutely. We start at 5:30, and how long does that go, Steve? 5:30 to 8:30.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, great. Councilmember Duclos.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. My question to you and the Port, and maybe you can speak about this when you come to the community center, is, however, many of us here live in the flight paths, and we get noise already, all through the night, practically, and especially in the summertime when you're trying to open up the windows to let some breeze in. What is the Port going to do about that? Because we have a quality of life here that we should not have impacted negatively by the planes going over all the time.
So I'll talk about a couple of different things. One is that our managing director, Lance Little, in connection with the airport cities, have formed a Seatac Stakeholder Advisory Roundtable that's called START. That group is meeting every other month. I think it's the last Wednesday of the month. Third Wednesday of the month. Sorry about that. And the most recent meeting was held toward the end of June, so there'll be another one in August. At the top of the list of that committee is ways that we can act now to try to reduce noise impacts. And at the last meeting, a long list of suggestions was recorded based on input by the members, and we're going to form a working group or groups to look at those measures to see what we can do. There are, to be honest, I know this is not what people may want to hear, but there are limits to what we can do because we need to comply with federal law and because the FAA has a major role in the operation of the airport, specifically with respect to airspace. That doesn't mean that we can't look at ways to try to lessen the pain that people feel, and that is part of the intent of the
There's two
START.
things here. There's the health of the people, but there's also the value of their property is reduced. So those are things that the Port needs to pay some attention to. When I first moved out here, it was a lovely little airport, and now it's a big, huge thing with a lot of traffic getting in and out of it, and the flights do come over, especially in the summertime. I know it goes over my house, and there's been times when they've actually shaken my house. So I think the Port needs to be a little bit more receptive to the people who live here.
Thank you for those comments. I just want to add, and Commissioner Calkins asked me again to express his regrets that he wasn't able to stay. The Port is working with partners on those existing constraints to what we can do. We've worked with Congressman Smith on federal legislation, with the senators. We're working to try and, I would say, improve that toolkit for how one can tackle noise and the impacts that you suggest. We're very aware. I think we're looking for ways to do better and appreciate that Federal Way is a member of START and has representatives that participate, and look forward to working with you to try and improve those things that you've mentioned.
And we've got two of those representatives with us today, Chris Hall and John Reesing, and our staff person, Yarden Weidenfeld. And, myself and John Reesing actually met with the congressman, our congressman, last year in regard to an ultrafine piece of legislation in regard to ultrafine particles that are emissions. I would note, again, at the very next city council meeting on August 14th, we're going to lay out the city's approach after the very extensive and hard work by our local group that'll set forth what our strategy is. But I do think, obviously, there are a lot of folks that have a distinct lifestyle issue about being able to have their doors open or being able to sit on their decks and have a conversation, and just that constant, it's not an irritant, it's an inability to have a conversation with the person sitting right next to you. So obviously, as things go from 18 million to 36 million in the next 20 years in regard to number of passengers, so something's got to give. But I think one of the things we talked about at the Puget Sound Regional Council is making sure that, and we're going to talk about this in regard to scoping, but there's got to be a capacity. There's got to be at some point where we say we've hit the fill line. So, Councilmember Kopang?
Yeah. I want to thank you for your presentation tonight. I think we're seeing some impacts down here, definitely in regards to sound. And my wife and I bought our first home in Des Moines in 1992 and went through the mitigation process. Got the triple pane windows, got the additional insulation, got the extra drywall on the wall facing the traffic or the airway, the flight patterns. Excuse me. All that helped when we were inside. But when we were outside living life, it was just too much for us. So we moved to Federal Way in '96, and it was quiet. It's not quiet anymore. And I know that we've talked about, in talking to Stan, we talked about that actually the sound profile has gotten smaller because the airplanes have gotten quieter. But the evidence that I have in my own life, and is we are seeing noise that's very similar to what we experienced in Des Moines that caused us to move south. And again, I think that from a quality of life standpoint, there are some things that I think that can change, and I know that there is some work being done on that, but I think it's very important that the port understand that there's significant impact on people in my neighborhood, which is Marine Hills, but on other areas of Federal Way as well. The impact of the third runway. I know I looked at the buyout area for runways 1 and 2, and what is the buyout area for the third runway, and it was significantly shorter. But the understanding I had was that because the airplanes are so much quieter now than they were when those buyouts initially occurred in the 70s, that it wasn't necessary to go as far south and as far north. That's all well and good, but the airplanes are now flying over neighborhoods that were not being flown over at that point, and there are some impacts that I think, whether it's the unique contours of the land in Marine Hills in particular, but I think all along the North Shore there of Federal Way, there is a significant impact from the sound coming off the water that needs to be addressed. I know one of the things that was talked about, and I'm going to get to a question at some point here, but I just kind of wanted to give you a little background here. We really are just struggling trying to find, is there some relief on the way? One of the things that was talked about was just increasing the flight path, or the glide slope, a quarter of a degree. And I think it's already being done in Dusseldorf or somewhere in Germany, but it's started, and that could have some positive effect. Can you give us any hope for some changes coming our way that could actually address the concerns that might certainly Federal Way, but in particular my neighborhood, is experiencing right now?
I'm going to have Arlen talk a little bit about the noise work that's underway, although I don't believe it comes down to Federal Way, but we always have ongoing insulation and other improvements that we're pursuing. And I'd like to take an IOU, if I can, Councilmember Copang, because we just started that work with our advisory roundtable. They're very invested in that work, and it's exactly as you've discussed. What else is happening? What can be done in Seattle? And I'd like to let that work happen a little bit, and they're specifically looking at what can be done in the near term, what would be possible. We have the FAA participating in that roundtable, as well as representatives from the two largest passenger carriers, as well as cargo logistics. So I think we have the right people gathered, and that's exactly what we're trying to pursue.
And I would just add that although we don't know how that effort is going to turn out, the port is sitting at the table as a committed member of that team. We do really take it really seriously. In terms of the programs that we are implementing now, I think it's fair to say, and you've essentially just commented on this, that there is currently a mismatch between the federal standard and threshold and what people you and others are experiencing. So I would encourage the city and the public to comment on that during the scoping for the environmental review. I know that what you're talking about refers to existing conditions and not to the additional growth that could occur, but it's an issue that's going to be relevant for that too, and it's a way to try to open the discussion on that topic.
All right, Deputy Mayor Honda?
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here, and it's good to see you again. I saw you this morning at Skateboard. I'd like to talk about something environmentally instead of noise. Noise is something that we can all hear. When we built our house 21 years ago, we didn't have airplanes flying over us. Now we do. And I think that pretty much everyone in this city is experiencing some sort of impact from the noise from the airplanes. But I'd like to talk about the impact from what happens when we have so many flights and what happens to us with the toxic metals and the toxic things that come out of airplanes. So the King County Board of Health had a study a couple years ago, I think it was 18 months ago, and it showed that the life expectancy in King County, in North King County, they're going to live 10 years longer than we're going to live. And they've actually broken it down by city. Some of it is based on education, some of it is based on diabetes and asthma and that kind of stuff. But I think a large portion of it has to be based on what we're experiencing from things that we can't see, things that are coming out of the airplanes into the soil, into the air, into our bodies. We know that we have an increased chance of cancer, of asthma, just being around the airport. So what has the port done to assess the health of those of us who live near the airport?
I'm going to try to answer at least part of your question. So the port has contributed $75,000 toward a study that is currently being conducted by the University of Washington to look at ultrafine particulates, which are very small particles that get past the blood barrier and may have health effects. And that study started recently and is continuing. So we don't know what the outcome of that is. The first part of the study is to do monitoring around the airport and to try to understand, do aircraft contribute to the levels of these particles around the airport. With respect to toxic chemicals and health risks, unfortunately, I'm not the qualified to answer that question. That's really a toxicologist or State Department of Health question, but we can take that question away and come back to you with an answer.
Thank you. I think it's really important because as we get smarter and as our scientists grow more adept at looking at things such as the toxins that come out of airplanes, that kind of stuff, we know more of the impact on the human body. And it's really, it's kind of scary to think that we have elementary schools right under the flight path. It's scary to think of those little tiny kids whose bodies are just starting to grow and they're so susceptible to more things than adults are. I really think that the Port of Seattle would be miles ahead if they would do a comprehensive study on the health of the communities that are around the airport. And why are we dying 10 years faster than those in King County, in northern King County? I think the airport has something to do with it.
Thank you for your comments.
All right. Councilmember Stephanie Dawson.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. One of the things that in looking at the SAMP, the executive summary, there's no mention of, under alternatives, there's no mention of other potential airports. I know Commissioner Ryan just spoke to that a little bit, but it's not in the document. So I just wanted to ask why. That's one of my questions.
Let me respond in part. So the master plan for Seatac is about Seatac, and it's a facility plan, as I mentioned. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't necessarily discuss that if it were appropriate, but the Port of Seattle does not have any jurisdictional authority over other airports. So we're not able to talk about an airport system as you might find in another state or area. We acknowledge fully that there are other airports, and especially there's other airports that are having passenger service or potential passenger service. We think that's a good thing. It reflects that there's market activity and growth in other parts of the region, and that helps take some pressure off of Seatac and its unique role. But we're not able to direct growth to someone else's facility, especially if we don't have the authority to do so. That type of larger planning role is exactly what the Puget Sound Regional Council's baseline capacity study is going to look at, and that's being funded by a grant from FAA. And I want to give credit to our colleagues at FAA who recognize that this is becoming a larger, important question in this region, that Seatac is continuing to grow. What are our options? So this study that kicks off and goes for about a year or so, I think, is designed to say, what do we have? How is it being used? What is the future bringing? What questions then does this pose for the region, and how should we proceed?
And go ahead,
go ahead.
Councilmember. Go ahead.
It's a different question, though.
Please.
Unrelated.
Yeah.
And then my other question is around the projections. So you, in 2034, you're projecting to have over 540 million passengers coming through. But we've already exceeded the 2017 numbers. Okay. So when these projections are being made, we already know that the permanent capacity is already like extremely, planes taking off and landing is just.
It's high.
Is high. So how much higher can we get? Question number one. And then number two, are we also factoring that like business travel may reduce based on the fact that we're using a lot of technical like teleconferencing and whatnot. So that may reduce the flight. I don't know. I'm just wondering if all that is being factored into this calculation, and if so, the 540 million is not even gonna.
So just to clarify a couple of things, so the passenger forecast for 2027 is 56 million passengers, and for 2034 is 66 million passengers. And the phased approach that we are going to be analyzing in the environmental review document is for the 2027 number. And the number of operations that goes with that is 480,000 total air operations. And an operation is a takeoff or a landing, so flights, essentially. The reason that we are taking the phased approach is that we found that as you get into the late 2020s, that the level of delay that's occurring, how long an aircraft has to wait before they take off or, after they land or waiting to land, exceeds the thresholds that the FAA considers to be good thresholds for planning, essentially. And you get to a point where it's not that the airport is at gridlock, but that it gets a lot harder for the airport to grow. So we took that kind of trend that we saw happening toward the end of the 2020s and said, okay, we're not going to look beyond that point because, as Claire said earlier, there are some major constraints we would have to resolve to do that, and we're going to stop for now at 2027. So the forecast, I can't say specifically, does it take into account somebody who's telecommuting, but in a larger sense it does, in that it's looking at a variety of market factors and economic factors, including the type of employment that occurs in the region and kind of what people are doing in terms of traveling for business or not.
But also, as to your, were you saying something?
Oh, just that Claire reminded me that the forecasts were vetted with the airlines and with the FAA.
So you said something that you're looking no further than 27. Why not look into the 30s? Because it sounds like we're going to go from up to like 64 million passengers by 2036. Why stop in the 20s and not think about the 20-year horizon?
Well, we thought about it extensively, and we have a plan that we think is a good plan in terms of the facilities needed, but there's a couple of big constraints that have to be resolved, and we have to understand them and how to address them. One is basically financial. That's probably the easiest to understand. It costs a tremendous amount of money to do the type of improvements that would be needed, and we have to show that we can justify that by having the traffic come. So until we know if we can manage the traffic, we can't really build to meet that bigger picture. The traffic is dependent very basically on what we would call the air side, the airfield part where the planes are, and the concrete that you use, and the amount and the ability of the planes to come in and leave and get to a gate and do all of that with an acceptable level of delay, or frankly no delay. And what we would call land side, which is the terminal and the road system, we have to be able to process enough people. So here's an example. I think you're probably familiar with our parking garage and then our terminal, narrow roadway, and it's constrained. To expand that terminal and take 20 million more passengers through that building is a tremendously expensive undertaking. Do we knock off the nose of the parking garage? Do we go across the roads? Do we go up? Do we go down? And so we don't know what it would take to meet the full forecast demand without really assessing both on that land side and the air side. How do we, to pour enough concrete that we can move that many more planes is a very expensive undertaking called the South Aviation Support Area. We own the property, but we have to bring it up to grade, we have to fill it, we have to connect it to the airfield, and to do that is a few $1 billion. So you have to understand, can I do it? Can I fund it? Is it feasible?
And what I don't think a lot of people understand or know is that the footprint of the Seatac Airport is much smaller than the regional, than many of the national airports. Like in comparison to Denver International Airport or Dallas-Fort Worth, that have much larger footprints. We're really constrained. The Seatac Airport is very much constrained. That's why I think what we're all sort of circling around, so to speak, is the concept of capacity. And that's why I think the PSRC added language in regard to their scope on this study about capacity and impact of surrounding communities is absolutely essential, because at some point that we've got to have a point where we think about other locations, but we think about there has to be a point in which we say no more. I mean, it'll not only is there not the physical room there or the ability to squeeze people in there, but it's going to have such a negative impact on the surrounding communities that it's really going to not only drive the properties down, but also the quality of life. So it does seem to me that that at some point, based on the small footprint of the airport, that this capacity issue goes to the very heart of what we're talking about.
Well, we've been meeting with FAA and PSRC for about a year, exactly because we agree with you on the importance of that question and how to address it and move it forward. We're very pleased that they're undertaking the study, and we think it's important, and we know that our work will play an important role in what they learn.
And I would say, just to, I'm going to hold off for a moment. Councilmember Duclos, do you have something else?
Well, I just wanted to ask, what about Payne Field, expanding that? And
Yes,
getting
they're,
more, let's share the wealth here.
and that's underway. They have a new terminal being built with, I think, up to four gates. We think that's great. Alaska thinks it's great. I think it's Alaska and United and Southwest that are considering having operations there. It's owned and operated by Snohomish County Airport, so we mostly just give them a thumbs up from our side of the county line. When you think about it, if you put your city hat on, you have to then think, okay, how do all those new passengers get there? The road infrastructure, the processing, the handling. It's not that it's not a great idea. It just comes with a lot of built-in new work that you have to manage, and that's
Well,
just what we
I
don't
lived
wanna
in
forget.
Chicago, and I went to O'Hare, and I lived outside of Boston, and I went to the airports there, so I know all about going through tunnels and everything, and you just have to plan for your trip and go, but I think I'd like to see the wealth spread a little bit amongst everything and not have it all here.
I think
on
that's
us.
the discussion underlying the Puget Sound Regional Council study, is exactly that.
Thank you.
All right, Councilmember Tran?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for your presentation. For the interest of time, I'm going to go right into my questions. I have two questions, actually, and I don't know if you can do this, but number one, can you require the airlines to fly a little bit away further from the residential area? So that's number one. Number two, can you have ability to limit number of flights in and out during certain time of the day so that the resident can get some relief?
So the answer to both questions is no. The FAA operates the airspace and has sole control over it. And so we cannot tell the airlines or the FAA move the planes over here or over there. That being said, through the work of the START, there may be attempts to look at locations of flight paths. It's hard to know at this point because that effort has just started. The other question was about limiting flights during certain times of day. Again, that's something we cannot require of airlines due to the federal obligations that we have to meet, but we can talk about ways to perhaps come to agreement with the airlines to reduce flights on a voluntary basis, and that's something we're willing to try to undertake.
Thank you.
And once again, I would say, at the very next city council meeting, we're going to be talking about our approach. I would also say, for everybody to know, for the public and for the council, our commission members, our Safe and Quiet Skies task force members, Britt Oleg, John Reesing, the chair at the time, myself, and Yarden, actually sat down with the Wing Command at McCord Air Force Base to talk about this very issue, because in the southern portion of our city, we were getting, sort of in your part of the neighborhood, we were getting flyovers from Air Force traffic, which was flying very low, and let them know, really. But John was very persuasive with the Air Force Command there about being good neighbors and making sure that those kind of overflights do have a lifestyle impact. But I think...
I was eating dinner one night, and one of those planes went over, it shook my whole table.
Right. I do think that we need to be, obviously, we're going to be analyzing our options. We want to make sure that when we roll this out, we're going to make sure everybody gets a copy of this very detailed report. But I think one of the things that's happening right now on a regional scale is how to address the long-term, way down the road in regard to solid waste. And there's a huge issue or debate that's occurring in regard to solid waste about waste to energy or landfills, and what does that look in regard to 10 years, 20-year horizon, or actually 2040 is one of the major stopgaps, and then the far down the road. And I would strongly suggest that we take a little bit more far-reaching look in regard to what's the future, and that's why I think we are really talking about a second airport. Deputy Mayor Honda, did you have a, okay. All right, anyone, Councilmember Johnson?
Just a quick follow-up in terms of public outreach and engagement. So Bellevue, Burien, and it looks like South Seattle, Georgetown campus had open houses. Are we planning to have one in South Sound, in Des Moines, Seatac, or Federal Way?
You're going to have a scoping meeting that's specific to gathering official public comment on the scope of the plan as proposed. It will be here in Federal Way. There's also one in Des Moines, Seatac, and Beacon Hill, South Seattle area. So the first, the round of meetings that you referred to were to wrap up the plan, make sure the planning information was shared, but the meeting coming to Federal Way is an official record and part of the process where we'll be capturing comments.
All right, council, any other, we do have public comment we want to get to. I do want to say, I've only got one pink sheet. If anybody would like to make a presentation to the council, please fill out a pink sheet, or if, we've got about 20 minutes left. So the one and only pink sheet I have at this point is Dana Holloway. Ms.
And I
Holloway.
want to thank you all. There's copies of the materials in the rear.
And one of the things I want to say is, so we're going to need everybody's help here. I want to thread a needle here, and I want to let me just explain this. I think it's very important that the public is here and has an opportunity to talk. Obviously, it's at the core of what we do. We work for you, and everybody else up here feels this exact same way. But what we want public comment to us. But if you hear a public comment, I'm going to, at the very end of public comment, if there's more comments, if you have a particular instead of what I want to avoid is a back forth, unhealthy dialogue. What I want to do is, if anybody wants to come up and ask questions that they want answered, if you could stay, listen to the questions, and when we get all done with public comment, if you have an opportunity to address those, I think that may be a much more effective way to go about it. What I don't want is, and what we can't have, is people coming up to the podium and directing questions directly to you.
Yeah, we don't like it either.
Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and do that. I've got thank you very much, great presentation, very much appreciated. Ms. Holloway, and anybody else who wants to make a public comment, let us know. All you have to do is fill out a pink sheet and provide it to Stephanie Courtney, our city clerk. Ms. Holloway.
Good evening. My name is Dana Holloway. I've been a resident of Federal Way for 42 years. The majority of people, myself included, focus on airplane noise because it's the most obvious. We all experience it. However, tonight I want to mention about the environmental toxic impacts from aircraft emissions and pollution that cause diseases in humans, in flora, plants, fauna, animals, and shortening our lifespans. Thank you, Susan. Exposure to loud noise from living underneath the flight path over a long period of time can or does increase the risk of developing high blood pressure and having a stroke. The most common cause of death due to air pollution from airplanes are cardiovascular and respiratory diseases, including lung cancer, according to the UN's World Health Organization. Other health impacts are brain damage and brain cancer, those ultrafine particulates that you're breathing in. This toxicity is in the soil, making it dangerous to consume fruits and vegetables grown in your own yard if you live under the flight path or wherever the air goes. From the Highline Forum, and I forget which one it was, I think it was the last Highline Forum, a gentleman, I think his name was Roger, and I'm going to steal some of his thunder there, but I'm restating it because it was really good. We need a toxicology studies and risk assessment studies, including exposure pathways. How does it get into your body? And an ecological risk to flora and fauna and human health risk. Must be done in communities around the airport and flight paths, and the data evaluated and published before any increase in the number of air operations. It's not just the noise. The port's master plan should be rejected until this can be done. It's our health. It's our lives. Thank you.
Thanks, Dana. Chris Hull, and then J.M. Page.
Thank you. A state-funded study in 1997 on the impacts and the mitigation of the third runway predicted that Federal Way's single-family residences would have an average loss in property value in today's dollars of $102,000 each, for a combined total loss value of $330 million. So that yielded, I mean, you know, to the city council here, that's a loss in revenue for taxes of $11.6 million for the city, according to the study. Actually, that $11.6 million was in 1995 dollars. I didn't adjust that one. For environmental mitigation of noise and vibrations, Federal Way as a whole was recommended to need $148.1 million or $244 million in today's dollars in mitigation costs. Federal Way has received nothing for that. The same study, so again, this is on the, prior to the third runway opening, why this was done. The same study recommended that a quality of life indicator model be created for Federal Way and the other 4 cities that were impacted by the third runway. This model was to be used to identify changes in the relative quality of life over time, so it may be the basis for identifying a needed socioeconomic mitigation measures for the third runway. This quality of life tool was never created. For that study, we've exceeded the maximum number of landings that it predicted the third runway would have. The SAMP that we kind of touched on tonight, I saw the executive summary, as I know you all have, says the third runway needs to become primary for landings in the North Flow operation to avoid large delays. It wants to add more flights than Portland, Oregon currently gets on top of the huge number that we have today. I don't believe this is a sustainable airport master plan. We need another airport, as has been identified. Somehow Payne Field has gotten a moratorium on moving forward with a maximum of 24 flights per day that they had agreed to. And that was the most that they were allowed to do at all, and they were able to get a moratorium on that. We endure over 1,100 every day, while the port continues to market 24-hour, no curfew access to cargo carriers, and sets the goal of being the West Coast gateway of choice to Asia. Please decide that the airport is at maximum capacity and begin to site a new airport. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you, Chris, for also your service on START and for your service on our task force report. And Chris will be here along with our other members at the next council meeting. J.M. Page. Is it Jim? Oh, I'm sorry.
My handwriting. I'm essentially going to echo pretty much what the previous two folks mentioned, is that I've been in this neighborhood since 1959.
Can you use your microphone?
This one?
Yeah. Thanks, Jim.
Basically, I'm going to echo what the two previous folks have said. I've lived in this neighborhood since 1959. Been around for a while. When we moved out here, airplane noise was a rarity. And now it's every day, every moment, every minute practically occurrence, particularly since the third runway's come in. And now it's coming more over our house than it was prior to the third runway opening. My issue that I bring up again is echo of the capacity. When is Seatac going to reach the capacity that it is going to? Personally, I think it has. Or if it hasn't, it's pretty damn close. Now, we've got a couple of large airports in the area, Payne Field being one. The NIMBYs up there have been pretty successful about diverting the commercializing that airport until just very recently, and hopefully that's the toe in the door, but I think we need to keep pushing on that door. The other one is the one at King County at Boeing Field. Is another option. There is a terminal there. It used to be used. I don't know that it's used that much anymore, but to me, what this stresses, what Linda Dawson was alluding to was we need a regional plan. There needs to be a regional plan like there are in other areas of the country, around the world, where we aren't the only dot, if you will, on the map for landing and taking off in commercial and cargo air traffic. It needs to be regional, and not just Puget Sound, but Portland, Spokane, Moses Lake. There are also airports there that they could be utilized, and there's a hell of a lot more land around them than there is around Seatac. So that's my put. We need a regional plan. It needs to be a comprehensive regional plan. I thank the two folks that showed their plan this evening. It is looked somewhat comprehensive. One recommendation is, as a person who's given hundreds of presentations over my lifetime, you need a laser pointer. You know, that would have been very helpful, especially with that map. That would have been very helpful following people around. So that's my put. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And I know that the discussion about Moses Lake has centered around perhaps moving a lot of cargo traffic out to Moses Lake, and that's something we were talking about as well. We were actually talking to the Air Force about some of that as well. All right, Yarden, can you please come up to the podium? There are a couple things I need you as you walk over there. You've been meeting with some of the other area city managers and leaders from the other airport-affected cities. And can you talk about the study that we're working on, the efforts that are ongoing right now, and that's the product of last year's legislative session. And then the second thing I need you to talk about is the state legislation where we're talking about extension that we dropped last year and we'll be seeking again regarding getting protections to come down into federal way.
Sure. Thank you, Mayor Farrell. Yes, so I think it was probably a few months ago when this city council passed a unanimous resolution to support the passage of proviso that was sponsored by our own Representative Pliciotti, who's also, Mr. Mayor and Council is in the chambers as well. And that provided $300,000 in funding towards a study of the impacts of the airport, specifically mentioning the 6 cities of Burien, Des Moines, Federal Way, Normandy Park, Seatac, and Tukwila. That was conditional only on the a provision of a match of another $300,000 from those 6 cities. Seatac, the city of Seatac was then, had already decided essentially to match whatever the other 6 cities came up with. So as Mayor Farrell had said, he designated myself to be the representative to that group consisting of the city managers of the 4 cities plus the economic development person from Tukwila to negotiate that. And just yesterday, actually, we completed that, and Mayor Farrell will be recommending to council a provision of approximately trying to remember, I think it's at $74,000, I believe it is, from the city of Federal Way towards that project. The other cities are coming up with an equal amount, and then Seatac is putting in a full $150,000. And that would be paid back to the city of Seatac over the next couple of years, and that'll be part of the mayor's recommendation. And currently, the city attorney is reviewing the proposed interlocal agreement on that, and that'll likely be presented at the next city council meeting. We've been discussing over the last day, actually just starting yesterday, with the Department of Commerce, which will be running the study, about what the exact scoping of that study will be. And Mayor has designated me as being part of that committee, but I'll be soliciting input from our experts as well. And that'll include just most of what's been talked about today, the issue of noise, the issue of health, particularly the issues of noise and health impacts are what I indicated was exactly what discussed today was the main concerns of the city of Federal Way. And that'll be, the study will, the scoping should be done by the end of the summer. The study will then commence. We've decided, the group has decided there'll be some public meetings before the scoping is done, just like the airport has done on the SAMP. And then when the second draft of the study is released, which is targeted for August of 2019, there'll be another public comment period with more public meetings before the final product is issued. So does that answer your question, Mr. Mayor?
It does. I just want to make sure. So we've got a University of Washington study, a Puget Sound Regional Council study, the SAMP that we're talking about right now, and are there any other that can be?
Well, the University of Washington study also, I should mention, is they're only in the first phase right now, which is looking at the prevalence of ultrafine particles around the Seatac Airport. once that phase is completed, the plan is to actually have a second phase, which will then be looking at the health impacts of ultrafine particles. And then in addition, Mayor Farrell, as you had mentioned, there is still legislation pending. It did not pass in the current Congress, but Congressman Smith has legislation that would actually fund a federal study on ultrafine particles, which the mayor and Mr. Reesing actually contributed to some of the wording on that. So that's still pending as well. And Mayor, I think you had a second question as well.
I do want to go back that when we talk about ultra-fine particles, I forget, John would be able to know off the top of his head, but we're talking about not just small things that you can actually see. We're talking, when we say ultra-fine, we mean ultra-fine that would literally, that kind of just sinks into the membranes.
The cells, it's smaller than a cell, if I understand correctly. It's there's standards right now for fine, what they call fine particles, and there's environmental standards on that. But there's currently the EPA or any agency, they do not have any legal standards for ultrafine particles. It's kind of an emerging area. There's been, I think it was at the Highline Forum that Dana Holloway mentioned. There was the one that was here, I believe. They showed about how there was like maybe 2 or 3 studies a year up until a few years ago, and then suddenly in the last couple of years, there's been 6 or 7 studies a year on ultrafine. So I think it's 10 nanometers, I believe, is I don't remember the exact size, but very, very small, much smaller than fine particles.
All right.
So,
thank you. Does anybody have any questions about these steps that are being taken? And again, August 14th, we're going to have the meeting here at 7 p.m. I do want to say that, we had back in November of 2015 a meeting in this very council chambers in which we packed the room. Many of the people here were present during that meeting. It's very important. This is like 3-dimensional chess to address this, as you could see with the port, with the with the port and its governmental structure, with the state legislature, with the federal government, with the local governments. One of the things that I think is very important to understand is, and this is why we set forth on the task force, is that we want to be very thoughtful and deliberate and calculated about how we proceed as a community about this, and not just what sometimes people refer to as the Star Wars theory about waving your saber around at whatever comes its way. There are a lot of moving parts and a lot of different ways to approach this. What we want to do is be very deliberate as a community about how we approach this to make sure that when we assert ourselves as a community, it's done to where the nearly 100,000 people who live in this community are heard loud and clear. That's our commitment to you. I look forward to talking to you more about that on August 14th. Council, any other questions? All right. Thank you very much. Great meeting, everybody, and thank you to the port for the presentation. We're in recess until 7 p.m.